General Motors sold 4 million cars in China in a single year. 4 million. That is more vehicles than most countries register across their entire auto market, sold by one American company in one country in 12 months. Buick, a brand that barely registers with young car buyers in the United States, was once so revered in China that the country's last emperor personally owned one, and that same car survived World War II to end up in the hands of Mao Zedong's own deputy. Right now, in 2026, American car brands are disappearing from Chinese roads faster than almost anyone in Detroit predicted. This isn't really a tariff story, and it isn't a trade war story either, even though both of those are real and both make things worse. This is a story about 4 separate American car companies who each looked at the same warning signs in the same market at the same time and made almost identical mistakes. So how does a country whose last emperor personally chose an American car end up pushing every American brand toward irrelevance? That's what this video is about. The exact moment each of these companies stopped listening to the market that made them rich, and the specific decisions that turned China from Detroit's biggest opportunity into its biggest cautionary tale. To understand how big this fall really is, you have to understand how completely American brands once owned this market. In 1924, the last emperor of China, Puyi, bought 2 Buicks. He wasn't an outlier. Buick became the car of choice for Chinese elites, warlords, and diplomats for decades. So much so that when General Motors went looking for a brand to anchor its new joint venture with Chinese state automaker SEC in 1999, Buick wasn't a hard choice. It was the obvious one. GM's own account of the decision is blunt about it. Buick was selected largely because of its legacy in China as a prestigious automobile. GM became the first global automaker to build a genuinely modern product line inside China, and it got a decade-long head start on almost every rival because of it. That bet paid off in a way almost nobody in Detroit expected. By 2013, Buick alone was selling over 800,000 vehicles a year in China, more than it sold almost anywhere else on Earth combined, built on a lineup of sedans and minivans tailored specifically to Chinese buyers who wanted a chauffeur-friendly back seat as much as a badge. At its peak, roughly 80% of Buick's entire global sales volume came from inside China alone, a level of dependency almost no other American car brand has ever had on a single foreign market. China didn't just become an important market for General Motors, it became the market. By the early 2000s, China had overtaken the United States as GM's single largest country by sales, and it held that position every single year through 2023. GM kept building on the momentum. Cadillac launched a dedicated China push, opening its own local plant to build cars specifically for Chinese buyers. Chevrolet expanded its lineup. By 2017, at the absolute peak, General Motors sold 4 million vehicles in China in a single year, a number so large it's still the high watermark the company measures itself against. And this wasn't some side project either. The joint venture with SAIC ran roughly 50-50, which meant every dollar of that 4 million car empire came with a Chinese state-owned partner sitting right across the boardroom table, learning exactly how GM designed, built and marketed cars for its own customers. Keep that 50-50 structure in mind, because it's going to matter a lot more later than it seemed to at the time. China's importance to GM only grew as the rest of the company's global footprint shrank around it. Through the 2010s, GM sold off or shut down operations in Europe, Russia, India, Thailand, and Australia, retreating to focus almost entirely on North America and China. By the time that retreat was finished, those 2 markets were carrying an outsized share of GM's global earnings. In other words, GM wasn't just successful in China. It had made China one of only 2 markets on Earth it could actually afford to lose, which meant everything happening there from this point forward was never going to stay a regional story. If you're wondering how a company builds an empire like that only to watch it crumble, stick around, because the next part is where it all starts to unravel. And if you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. How giant companies build empires and then walk themselves off a cliff. Hit subscribe if you want the next one delivered straight to you. Because in the middle of GM's best year ever in China, the seeds of its collapse were already being planted a few hundred miles away, by companies nobody in Detroit was taking seriously yet. The story of the crack doesn't start with a scandal or a recall. It starts with a decision the Chinese government made years earlier, and a bet Detroit chose not to match. Starting in the mid-2000s, Beijing began pouring subsidies into homegrown electric vehicle makers, treating the EV transition as a national industrial strategy rather than a niche product category. Companies like BYD, which started as a battery maker, were handed a runway that American automakers simply didn't have back home, where EV adoption was still a fringe bet through most of the 2000s and 10s. Purchase tax exemptions, manufacturing subsidies, and government trade-in programs later worth billions of dollars all pointed buyers toward one thing: a domestically built electric or hybrid vehicle. In just the second half of 2024 alone, one national trade-in program helped move more than 3.7 million vehicles, according to China's Ministry of Commerce, almost all of them toward domestic new energy brands. This wasn't a subtle nudge. It was a decade-long government-funded campaign to build a domestic auto industry that no longer needed American or European technology at all. For years, none of this looked like an emergency. GM, Ford, and Jeep's Chinese joint ventures were still profitable, still comfortable, still leaning on the same combustion engine playbook that had worked since the 1990s. Then, in January 2023, Tesla cut prices on the Model 3 and Model Y in China by as much as 13% overnight. The move was meant to defend Tesla's own market share against rising Chinese competitors. Instead, it detonated an industry-wide price war that Chinese media now calls neijuan or involution, a spiral where every competitor keeps cutting prices just to survive, shrinking everyone's margins at once. Domestic brands, already manufacturing at a lower cost with government backing and their own battery supply chains, could absorb that war and keep growing through it. Legacy joint ventures built around expensive combustion engine platforms, imported components, and thinner margins simply could not. Within 2 years, what started as one company's pricing decision had reshaped the economics of the entire Chinese auto industry. So why didn't GM, Ford, and Jeep just cut prices to match and fight for share the same way? Because their cost structures weren't built for it. Chinese EV makers controlled their own battery production, end to end, and ran design cycles measured in months, not years. American joint ventures were still running combustion engine factories, built for a market that no longer wanted what they were making, with import duties on key components and design decisions still routed through approval chains back in Detroit and Dearborn. By the time a new model could be approved, redesigned, and shipped to Chinese showrooms, 3 Chinese competitors had already launched, priced lower, and moved on to their next generation. By the first quarter of 2024, the damage was already visible in General Motors' own books. The company posted a $106 million loss in China, its first quarterly loss in the country in over 15 years, and its worst outside of the pandemic. That wasn't a rounding error. That was the crack finally reaching the surface. But it gets worse, because General Motors wasn't the only American brand about to find out exactly how fast Chinese consumers can walk away. Jeep's collapse in China is the cleanest example of what happens when an American brand stops adapting fast enough. And it's an especially strange one, because Jeep's roots in China actually run deeper than Buick's. Back in 1984, American Motors Corporation signed a joint venture to build Jeeps in Beijing, making it the oldest foreign automotive joint venture in Chinese history, predating the Shanghai GM deal by 15 years. That venture eventually passed through Chrysler, then Fiat Chrysler, then Stellantis, before ending up as the GAC-FCA partnership that would ultimately collapse. The joint venture peaked in 2017 at 222,000 vehicles sold, riding the success of the Compass, Cherokee, and Renegade. Then the wheels came off, and not metaphorically. Chinese consumers began flagging serious complaints about excessive oil consumption in Jeep's engines, and the brand was named and shamed on China's biggest consumer rights television program, a moment that torched what was left of its reputation. Sales cratered from there, 125,200 units in 2018, 73,900 in 2019, 40,500 in 2020, just 20,100 in 2021. In May 2022, the joint venture sold exactly one car. One. By July 2022, GAC and Stellantis agreed to terminate the venture entirely. It formally filed for bankruptcy that October, and after 3 more years of illegal wrangling, a Chinese court declared it dead for good in July 2025. Creditors filed nearly $1.4 billion in claims against a venture that had once represented over $2.3 billion in combined investment. An entire American brand's manufacturing presence in the world's largest car market, gone, because it couldn't fix an oil consumption problem fast enough and couldn't out-innovate rivals who were already building electric. Not only did Jeep vanish from Chinese roads, but the same pattern started showing up at companies far bigger than Jeep ever was. Ford tried to see this coming. In 2019, the company launched what it called its China 2.0 strategy, promising to localize products, lean into electrification, and rebuild its relationship with Chinese buyers after years of underwhelming sales next to GM and Volkswagen. It didn't work fast enough. By 2025, Ford's Mustang Mach-E, its flagship EV and the centerpiece of that turnaround effort, sold a total of 35 units in China for the entire year, in a market where electrified vehicles now account for more than half of everything sold. Lincoln, Ford's luxury brand and one of its few genuine bright spots in China, saw its wholesale volume drop another 13% in the first quarter of 2026 alone. Meanwhile, General Motors took a $5 billion hit to its earnings in late 2024, split between a $2.6 to $2.9 billion write-down on its Chinese joint venture stake and $2.7 billion in restructuring charges. Sales had fallen nearly 20% that year alone, and by the fourth quarter, GM posted a net loss of $2.96 billion, a stark reversal from the $2.1 billion profit it had posted the year before. Full-year net income for 2024 dropped 40.7%, almost entirely because of what was happening 8,000 miles away in Shanghai. Here's the part that should really worry Detroit, though. Tesla, the one American brand that was supposed to be immune to all of this because it actually builds electric vehicles, posted its first ever year-over-year sales decline in China in 2025. Its domestic market share, which sat at 8.7% in September of that year, had collapsed to 3.2% by October, a 3-year low. Then it got worse. By April 2026, Tesla fell out of China's EV top 10 entirely, beaten not just by BYD but by Geely, Changan, Xiaomi, and Leapmotor, companies that barely existed in the EV conversation 5 years earlier. Sales of the Model 3 in China were down 66% year-over-year that month. Tesla's response has quietly been to lean on Shanghai as an export factory instead. In April 2026 alone, the Shanghai plant shipped 80% more vehicles overseas than it had a year earlier, even as the cars it sold to Chinese buyers kept shrinking. Not only is Tesla losing the fight for Chinese customers, but it's now using the same factory to arm the fight against its own home markets in Europe and beyond. That wasn't supposed to happen to the electric car company. There was another problem stacking on top of all of this, and it makes the whole situation stranger. For a while, GM and Ford tried to turn their excess Chinese manufacturing capacity into a lifeline, exporting vehicles built in China to markets like Mexico instead of selling them domestically. It worked for a while. Mexico alone accounted for roughly a quarter of Ford's 2025 sales, originating from China, and a striking 64% of GM's. But that lifeline is now closing too. New tariffs have made shipping Chinese-built Fords and GM's into the United States unprofitable, and Mexico itself is reportedly weighing its own tariff hikes on those same vehicles later this year. The one workaround Detroit found for its China problem is quietly shutting on both ends at once. The numbers, laid end to end, tell a brutal story. China was GM's single biggest market in the world every year, from the early 2010s through 2023. By 2025, GM's total China sales sat at less than half of its 2017 peak of 4 million vehicles. Foreign brands as a whole, once holding close to 2/3 of China's passenger vehicle market as recently as 2020, saw their combined share fall under 1/3 by 2025. In August 2024, Chinese domestic brands overtook foreign brands in combined market share, For the first time in the country's modern automotive history, that line, once crossed, has not gone back the other way. Cadillac, GM's flagship luxury brand and once the centerpiece of its premium China strategy, sold just 79,000 vehicles in China in 2024, edging up to 92,000 in 2025. Neither number comes close to justifying the dedicated factory GM built to chase Chinese luxury buyers a decade ago. So is there any way back for these brands? Right now, the data says no, or at least not soon. Bill Russo, founder and CEO of the Shanghai-based advisory firm Automotive, put GM's current position bluntly. They're surviving, not thriving. Buick, the brand a Chinese emperor once chose with his own money, is still on sale in China today. Between 2015 and 2018, it was selling over 1 million cars a year there. By 2024, that number had fallen to roughly 320,000. It clawed back to around 427,000 in 2025 on the strength of a new plug-in hybrid GL8 minivan and aggressive fixed pricing. But even that recovery leaves Buick nowhere near the brand it used to be. It is still on sale in China. It is no longer the brand anyone has to choose. So what actually went wrong? It came down to 3 mistakes, repeated by 4 different companies. First, every one of these brands treated Chinese consumer loyalty as permanent, built on decades-old reputations, instead of something that had to be re-earned every single product cycle. A century of goodwill from an Emperor's Buick or a joint venture's first-mover advantage doesn't survive one bad generation of cars if a cheaper, better-equipped domestic alternative is sitting right next to it in the showroom. Chinese buyers, especially younger ones, simply stopped caring which badge their grandparents respected. Second, they misread China's EV price war as a temporary storm to wait out, instead of a permanent restructuring of how cars get built and sold in the country, backed by a government willing to subsidize that restructuring for over a decade. Waiting for the price war to end turned out to be waiting for something that was never going to happen, because for Chinese automakers, this wasn't a war of attrition. It was the plan all along. Third, and maybe most costly, they let profitable joint ventures become cash machines to fund business back home, instead of reinvesting fast enough to keep pace with rivals who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Every dollar of China profit that got shipped back to Detroit instead of into new electric platforms and faster product cycles was a dollar Chinese competitors used to widen the gap. The strange part is that American companies are far from the only ones feeling this. The same Chinese brands that pushed GM, Ford and Jeep out of their own backyard are now exporting that exact playbook to Europe, Latin America and Southeast Asia, armed with cheaper batteries, faster software, and a decade of practice beating American car companies at their own game. And here's the twist almost nobody saw coming. The electric vehicle revolution that was supposed to be the American and European auto industry's ticket to the future is now the exact weapon being used against it, everywhere at once.